But if you'd have been part of a war cabinet
Yes.
in Britain,
Yes.
engaged in a military conflict with whomsoever it may be, would you not have wanted to argue more for genuinely seeking to protect civilian life?
Well, I believe that there were people who did, and I believe that the IDF, which is a citizen army in a rules-based democracy, has done everything it can.
Really? You believe that?
I do. In a grotesque conflict. And arithmetic here is horrendous because we're talking about individual lives lost, and we're talking about the lives of innocents who've been caught up in this horrible, horrible, horrible war.
If you were ever curious to hear both the pro-Israel and the pro-Palestine side and actually make a judgment for yourself, take a listen to this very fascinating discussion.
I've always found your stance on the Middle East and Israel strange.
Yes.
Because you strike me as being uber passionate.
Yes.
Which I always felt Murdoch was as well. I remember
Yes.
witnessing once a huge argument between Murdoch and James Murdoch, his son, in front of Tony Blair about Israel-Palestine. And so I just wondered, is that an influence? Or how have you independently got to a position that feels to me a little bit extreme?
It predates it. It's certainly the case that if you look at the sort of spectrum of opinion, particularly in the UK at the moment, I don't think you could describe my position as mainstream. I think that's probably fair. I don't know how often you could describe any of my positions as mainstream. That is certainly true. But it's something that I have grown up with. So I mentioned that my mum was a regular attender of the Church of Scotland. And as I grew up and attended it with her, the Church of Scotland at that time, things have changed, had a very close attachment to the Holy Land, and the story of the Jewish people was part of the sort of backdrop to my growing up. And I had a romantic attachment to their story. And again, you may recall, Alistair, Rory, the speech that Gordon Brown gave in the Knesset. And this was, of course, some time ago. You know, when he talked about for generations, you did not have a land, now you have a land. And it reflected a similar but not identical background to mine, obviously not identical. And his father was a minister in the Church of Scotland. So there's that. And then the second thing is that I feel a very strong identification, love actually, for the Jewish community in Britain and everything that they've achieved and done and admire so much about it. And then the third thing is that when I look at the position in which Israel finds itself, I can run through my understanding of the history, which you both might want to correct or challenge. But it just seems to me that this is one of the most amazing stories in humanity, and Israel's achievement is one of the most moving and powerful. And that obviously doesn't mean that it doesn't make mistakes. But my overall view is there's a queue of people who want to criticize Israel. And that's fine, but I'm not going to join them. I'm going to be on the side wherever I can defending it.
Even when they're doing what they're doing in Gaza?
Of course, I can take a view that they're making mistakes. And, for example, you can look at individual tactical decisions, like the bombing of the Hamas political leadership in Qatar. In Gaza, I think that the fundamental issue there is Hamas's control.
But if you'd have been part of a war cabinet
Yes.
in Britain,
Yes.
engaged in a military conflict with whomsoever it may be, would you not have wanted to argue more for genuinely seeking to protect civilian life?
Well, I believe that there were people who did, and I believe that the IDF, which is a citizen army in a rules-based democracy, has done everything it can.
Really? You believe that?
I do. In a grotesque conflict. And arithmetic here is horrendous because we're talking about individual lives lost, and we're talking about the lives of innocents who've been caught up in this horrible, horrible, horrible war. But the arithmetic would suggest that if you're talking about counterinsurgency warfare in an urban area, the level of casualties that the IDF have inflicted has been lower than we did or the Americans have done in similar, though not identical, conflicts. Now, it's horrible because
previous generations as well, attitudes change.
Yeah, attitudes change and so on. But we have never, thank God, been in a position where we've endured what Israel endured on October the 7th, nor have we faced what the people of Gaza have had to face. So emotions are bound to be engaged overall, and it's difficult to put oneself completely in those shoes. But as I say, there are so many people who, I think fairly and with sincerity and good faith, will criticize Israel. I sometimes think those criticisms are wrong, but I don't think that, there are some people who do argue in bad faith, but I think it's important to have some people who do see things instinctively as a starting point from Israel's point of view.
And the instinctive bit interests me, because given that you've decided to take such a strong position on this, how much time have you spent in Israel, in the West Bank, in Gaza? I mean, how much do you actually know about this region? So what worries me, obviously, listening to you, I think, spent a lot of my life working in that region.
Yes, of course.
And when I was in Parliament, I avoided taking pro-Arab or pro-Israeli positions when you were right in there.
Yes.
How much time have you spent in the region?
I think I've been to Israel and the West Bank 5 or 6 times now.
And for how long at a time in the West Bank? Do you spend the night there?
I have never been overnight in the West Bank. I've spent days there. I've visited Ramallah. I've talked to people in the Fatah political leadership. I've talked to people in Palestinian civil society.
So you've been there for...
I've talked to Palestinian academics.
You've been there for a few hours. You've been there maybe 20, 30 hours?
I would say... that would probably be, I would say more than that, but not much more than that.
Okay, so 20, 30 hours. So if I said I've been to Manchester on 5 occasions, and I've met some of the leaders, and I'm now going to make Manchester my big issue, and I'm going to have very strong views on Manchester, and I'm going to... Would people not say, what the hell do you think you're doing? You've spent 5 days on the ground, you don't know anything about it.
Well, the first thing is, I have been there. The second thing, though, is...
I've been to Manchester too, but I'm not setting myself up as an expert on Manchester after 5 days in Manchester.
No, I'm not setting myself up as an expert on, for the sake of argument, the precise boundaries of...
And also, you may remember that the country's tired of experts.
We'll come back to that. The precise geography of a particular settlement in a particular location. The other thing is that the fate of Israel concerns us all, because it is the case that the criticism directed at Israel falls into at least 2 categories. There's the natural criticism that one democracy would extend towards another when it believes that a fellow democracy or an ally is falling short of the standards that you would expect. But it is also the case that there is opposition to Israel, not because of what it does, but because of what it is. Israel's success is a standing rebuke to a particular view of the world, 2 particular views of the world. It's a standing rebuke to the Islamist view of the world, and it's a standing rebuke to the left-wing decolonization narrative, because Israel is a nation composed almost entirely of refugees and asylum seekers, with no natural resources, that when it was born had all of its neighbors attempting to strangle it in its cradle. It's now become the single most...
Michael, you don't really need to give me a lecture on the history of
Israel.
No,
but I have to explain that it is the single freest and most impressive jurisdiction.
The single freest and most impressive jurisdiction.
From Morocco to Delhi. And you have to ask, well, why has that happened? But also, why does it inspire such strong feelings? So when I was at the Labour Party conference, I asked Owen Jones why he spent all his time criticising Israel and didn't show any concern for Sudan or for what was happening in Xinjiang.
And could it possibly be that Sudan is not presented as our central ally? That Sudan is not a country that the United States has been providing billions of dollars of direct military support to? That Sudan has not been at the center of our entire political structures for 60, 70 years in the way that and that actually, to compare Israel to Sudan, given that Israel is a liberal democracy and one of our closest allies, is profoundly patronizing to Israel.
No, I think what happens is that people want to...
Because it seems to me there's a possible double standards here, right?
Well, there are double standards, and they apply to Israel.
On the one hand...
Israel is held to different standards from other countries.
This is becoming very whataboutery.
So on the one hand, a liberal democracy within a rules-based international order, and on the other hand, Sudan. Okay? These are not comparable countries, right? If Denmark suddenly started doing something and I said, well, how come you're not criticizing Congo in the same way that you're criticizing Denmark? The answer would be Israel would hope to be held to a higher standard than Sudan.
And it does operate to a far higher standard. But the question of course, is why is it that the United Nations has chosen to single out Israel in the way that it has, with the Zionism is racism motion being passed? Why is it the case that there is such hostility that's directed towards it? American support for Israel is like American support for Germany and NATO. It's support for a democracy or democracies that have been embattled. Why is it that all of Israel's enemies, its neighbors, until recently, have tried to not just check its manners or see an alteration in its policy, but eliminate it? And why is it that it's so important that we recognize that? Because anti-Semitism mutates over time, and anti-Semitism, from having been a religious prejudice and having been an ethnic prejudice, is now a prejudice against the Jewish home and a desire to tear it down.
Last one on this, Michael, because I understand your position. I was always profoundly confused in Parliament by British parliamentarians setting themselves up as advocates and friends for foreign countries. Right? I didn't take paid trips to Denmark. I didn't take paid trips to India or Israel or Saudi. I mean, these things were, I didn't think I needed to be a conservative friend of Israel, conservative friend of the Middle East. When people said, what's my position on Kashmir? My answer would be, I'm a British politician. Now, and that's somebody who spent most of his life working on foreign affairs. So one of the things that interests me is, would you say what you said about the Jewish community in Britain, about the Muslim community? Would you say that you feel, what was your phrase? I would say love and affection and admiration for what they've achieved. Would you say that about the Muslim community?
I would say that about people from within the Muslim community. I would say that about very, very dear Muslim friends. But I think there is something about the Jewish story, and in particular the Jewish experience in the 20th century, and the efforts which we've seen to destroy Jewish civilization, the Jewish race, and Judaism, that touches me in a way that isn't true of other communities. And I think that it is the case now that history teaches us certain lessons. And one of those lessons is that the safety and security of the Jewish community in any country at any time is the surest guide to how admirable and liberal that country is.
As opposed to how we look after the poor, as opposed to
how we look after prisoners, as opposed to how we treat Muslims, as opposed to many other questions.
I think it is the absolute acme. It is the gold standard of how civilized a society is.
Why, logically?
Because history shows you that whenever countries are moving towards authoritarianism, whenever they're moving into dark territory, it's the Jews who are turned on.
But Michael, it's
also the case that if one looks at those societies that were most liberal at any time, the Netherlands, for example, in the 16th and 17th century, Britain at the end of the 19th century, America throughout most of the 20th century, the most enlightened countries are those in which Jewish people have felt most safe.
In which Jewish people feel most safe, and I agree with you on that, and in which minorities in general feel most safe, and in which human rights are respected, and particularly the human rights of minority groups, of which the Jewish community is an incredibly important example. But the treatment of the Muslim community in Britain would also be a gold standard test for a civilized society.
The treatment of British Muslims, the treatment of British Hindus, the treatment of British Sikhs matters to me because, like you, I have a certain idea of Britishness, which means that how you treat every citizen, and indeed every person, even if they're not a citizen, who is subject to British laws and paying British taxes, is a key element in civilization. All I would say is that there's never been, thank heavens, anything to compare with the Holocaust. It was a unique crime, the worst evil of which mankind has ever been guilty, and it was directed not at a section of any population for random reasons. It was directed explicitly at the Jewish people, and that is why when we see a rising tide of anti-Semitism now, it's a moral obligation on all of us to ask why, to look at it, and certainly, of course, you can make a judgment about the government of Israel and its actions, but to blame the government of Israel's actions automatically for an increase in anti-Semitism, as though that were a mathematical formula and a rational one, is once again to blame Jews for prejudice against them.
Who's doing that?
Well,
I mean, you're talking to me as though I'm doing that.
No,
right?
you're not doing it, Rory.
Okay, right.
But it is emphatically the case that if you venture onto our streets or walk into the whirlpool of social media, you will find people who will. We've seen it in recent weeks, and some of the people who've been commenting on whether or not the fans of Maccabi Tel Aviv should be allowed to watch their team play Aston Villa. That doesn't mean that you can't make a judgment that might be a mistake in good faith, but there's a lot of bad faith out there.
But Michael, there are a lot of Muslims who
Yeah.
feel deeply unsafe in Britain right now.
Yes.
If you were walking through central London when Tommy Robinson had 150,000 people out on the streets, and I mean, I don't like the whataboutery, but I sort of feel they're being lost in this debate. And I also, would you not agree with me that one of the consequences of what's happened in the last couple of years within the Israeli debate is it's kind of been exposed as a bit of a myth that they ever really believed in a two-state solution?
Well, I don't think it's a myth. I think that it was very strongly the case that a lot of the Israeli population, a majority, have believed in a two-state solution. There's a very powerful speech that Bill Clinton gave, I think, when he was campaigning for Kamala Harris, when he explains the missed opportunity where the Palestinians were offered what was not a perfect, but certainly a good deal, and they walked away. I think things have changed, undoubtedly. I think support for a two-state solution in Israel has been ebbing, and I think it's been ebbing as a result of what's happened in Gaza. Israel, of course, withdrew, Hamas took over, the nature of that rule and other factors has meant that that's diminished. And then without, I hope, being naive, because who knows where the Trump peace plan will go, if it is the case that you have an absence of violence and Palestinian civil society is given the chance to develop, then I think that you could see support for a two-state solution within the Israeli population growing again. Because I think the number of people in Israel who actually think the Palestinians should never have a state is small. The number of people...
Very powerful.
There are some very strong advocates of that position.
That's not your position.
No. I think that there are a number of people in Israel who think, I can't contemplate a Palestinian state at the moment if that Palestinian state is going to be run by or under the influence of the sort of people who were running Gaza when October the 7th happened.
Okay, so, it's a bit frustrating watching clips like this, but every time this Michael Gove makes a point, they seem to pivot to either undermine his undermine his ability to have such an opinion, or to seek a reason why his motivations are not pure or coming from a bad place. And it's just not, that doesn't seem like, and every time he's making a good point, they seem to pivot to how the Muslims feel in the United Kingdom, for example, or the Arabs on the other side of the conflict, rather than addressing really the elephant in the room, which is that you can't have a Palestinian state or peace while Hamas and other terrorist groups remain in power. So it's a bit frustrating, but I think Michael Gove made some excellent points. He's coming from a place where he understands the Jewish story that didn't start with the creation of Israel in 1948. It goes back many thousands of years, and the state of Israel and the Holocaust and all these things are just many, many, many points of a very long and somewhat tragic, but also very hopeful story of the Jewish people. And Israel is just one of the more recent iterations of that story, of the Jewish people getting together, gathering their land and building a modern state. And it's quite beautiful what they've done. And when you look at the arithmetic, and again, it's very horrible to talk about things this way, but no other society or army in human history has protected civilian lives as much as the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. And even according to Hamas's own statistics, you can prove that case out. So as recent as the Iraq War, the United Kingdom and the United States participated in a very, very bloody conflict that cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives. And I'm not in a position to judge whether or not they were in the wrong for that. It's impossible to know, and I'm not an expert in the conflict. But to sit in judgment, some 10 years later on Israel while it's fighting on, 7 fronts, trying to get back its 250 hostages, fighting an urban battle where the Hamas terrorists commit a double war crime of attacking Israeli civilians and its army, of course, and hiding behind its own civilians. It's like, are we watching the same thing? Like, what are these people watching where they just have a different reality? It's kind of surprising. Anyways, that's it for this video. My name is Matan Hazanov. Thank you for watching. I'm a venture capitalist. I invest in early stage software businesses. And I have a podcast, the Profit or Pivot podcast, where I speak with entrepreneurs, innovators, investors, and other interesting people about their journey to success. If you want to reach out to me, ask a question, pitch your startup, or watch my podcast or YouTube channel, check my information down below, leave a comment, like all that fun stuff. Thank you for watching.